Hello, friends, and welcome back to another episode of Kirby Russia. As someone who's worked in the Russian media for over a decade, I get basically invited to do a lot of interviews. And I think it might be interesting for you and so sometimes in the past I've done these sort of where I basically answer interview questions I was given in Russian and English. Why would someone bother to do this? Because I think it actually gives an insight into the way the actual Russian media works. The actual sort of mentality of the journalists who ask these questions, rather than believing the Western mainstream narrative about Russia, which is that everything is just this like blunt, in-your-face propaganda, and basically they have their own imagination about the way the Russian media is. So I thought that this would be interesting. We'll go through a rather unusual list of questions. A lot of the times as a foreign person, I get asked basically the same 10 or 20 questions over and over and over again. And this is interesting because these questions are pretty different. They all have to deal with the national security strategy of Russia, which was mostly, or at least attributed to the vision of President Putin. And it says the objectives of state policy on the preservation and strengthening of traditional values are preserving and strengthening traditional values, ensuring their transmission from generation to generation, countering the spread of destructive ideology, the formation of the international arena of an image of the Russian state as the guardian and protector of traditional and universal spiritual and moral values. And there's a few things, but that's kind of the core part of this national security strategy of Russia that these guys wanted me to talk about. Note, maybe the first thing we should point out is that we're dealing with a national security strategy, which is also something of an ideological nature. Very interesting. So that's the first thing to note before we even get to the questions. But anyways, here are the questions. Number one, does America have such a national document? Yes and no. In the history of the United States, I mean, we've had things like the New Deal, which was an entire series of various documents. See, I thought the New Deal was kind of one big, like, presidential order, but apparently it's a big mess of a lot of stuff that Roosevelt put through. But essentially, it's kind of the vision of the president. There's definitely ideological elements of it and bureaucratic elements of it. And that we could say is maybe something of a similar nature. It's sort of an answer to the current problems of the nation coming from the president with some solutions in there. You could also look at Johnson's Great Society as being another similar such presidential movement, top-down, somewhat ideological, pretty ideological set of new policies and bureaucracies and excuses to spend money, this, that, and the other. We could also then go to the Patriot Act, which was actually something that would then officially have come from Congress because it's a federal law. But obviously, Bush Jr. certainly supported it. And it definitely had, again, this sort of sweeping, radical changes to American society based on the needs of the moment, supposedly. So we get into that. Maybe in a way, if we talk about sort of the mission of the United States as something more grand. Obviously, this is not a law, but the Project for a New American Century, it has been really influential on American foreign policy, and is unfortunately probably the reason that America's popularity has really gone down over the years. That Project for a New American Century was it wasn't a good document to make America a well-liked country or to provide stable development for the United States into the future. But so anyways, so is there something exactly like the Putin team's, or maybe even you should say the Security Council's big document? Yeah, kind of. I mean, again, the Project for New American Century wasn't a law, and it wasn't a packet of legal documents. But I would include it, so I think I can think of, at least off the top of my head, 4 instances in American history where there was sort of such a national document coming from somewhat top-down. Although, again, Project for New American Century is from a think tank, but a think tank of very important people. In fact, Bolton became even more important after that was all over, as did Crystal, or whatever his name is. What values are considered traditional? Question number 2. What values are considered traditional in America and in the West? Well, of course, we have the overall, we have the whole concept of individual rights. We have the Bill of Rights of the American Constitution, which really kind of spread out across over the Western world. And so it's a little bit different when we talk about the West and America, because the rights, the way someone in France or England might see Western individual rights and individual liberty, although they're very similar to America, there's definitely some nuances. Nuance number one is obviously the whole guns thing, that if we're going to value the individual, then the individual has to have the ability to take action, because power is related to the individual's ability to take action. That's not enshrined in the Constitution. That's my own personal opinion, but I think that that's where that comes from. So essentially we have the idea of putting the individual on a pedestal and not restricting the individual, and having these rights that are considered to be given by God, or for people who don't like the whole God thing, they coin the term natural rights, as in they come from some sort of abstract deist natural force of some sort. And yeah, so again, the real difference, the real thing about traditional values in America is they're all linked to individualism, they're all linked to the Enlightenment, and they're really all linked, again, especially in America, to this whole like Bill of Rights concept, and how that was all laid out there. So yeah, and the overall concept of liberty, that you can't, that the government should have a minimal influence on the individual. Unfortunately, sometimes people forget about how companies and the big businesses have an influence on the individual, but in the 1700s, things look differently. But yeah, that's what I'd say. So let's see. Question number 3. Can we say that the hierarchy of values in Russia is very different from the hierarchy of values in Europe? Well, the problem is with that is that in Russia there is no predetermined hierarchy of values. Within this document from, I guess, the Security Council, again, I'm assuming, but ultimately Putin's, with Putin's signature, which sometimes doesn't really mean much, because very often Putin just kind of signs things. But anyways, there is no hierarchy of values really listed in the national security strategy of Russia. In fact, the national security strategy of Russia is very vague, classic Russian vagueness, and isn't really very binding. That's a real popular word this year. And to be honest, it doesn't really assert a certain sort of clear vision of what a society based on traditional values is like. So if you are in the West and you go up to your Ron Paul types, your libertarians, well, who's really, in theory, again, the top of the chain is the individual and their individual rights, and the U.S. Constitution, which is, a sacred agreement between the governed and the governing, and so on and so forth, right? And that these are the rights of the individual supersede any sort of collective rights, which don't even really technically or shouldn't exist in a liberal society, so on and so forth. In this Russian document, you don't really get any of that. It's more just like the LGBT stuff is bad, so I guess the hierarchy is LGBT is out. That's the hierarchy. There's whatever sort of stuff was before the rise of that is in, that stuff is out, so it's not even a hierarchy. That's just exclusionary, maybe. But yeah, there's really no... after you've read the document in both English and Russian, I don't really see any sort of hierarchy of anything. It's not very well organized. It's not like the Bill of Rights, where you can look at it and the average American is going to go, cool, about guns, I can read about the Second Amendment. It's like 2 sentences or 3 sentences or whatever. Oh, about, the right to privacy. That's pretty short too. The whole freedom of the press thing and the freedom of speech thing, that's pretty short. We're talking about 3 or 4 sentences here, at their core. The Bill of Rights is right short. And very to the point, whereas this Russian security document, unfortunately, whereas like with the U.S. Constitution, we have this, the Declaration of Independence was sort of the philosophical, ideological justification to then later make some sort of constitution, and then the constitution came into being, and then later we had amendments to it. People forget that amendments are corrections, so apparently we kind of forgot about all those rights until after writing the Constitution. But anyways, at least that's what the verbiage makes it look like. We'll have to talk to some constitutional historians for the real truth on that issue, not from me. But so anyways, we're sort of in this thing where with the Russian document, we don't have this sort of separate preamble explaining the logic of the document and then getting into something short and memorizable. We have, it's almost written in a way kind of more like the Quran, but more wordy. Because the Quran will say something and then really get into the philosophy of why it is the way it is right after it. But it's also in the middle of sort of a really big text. Which is fine, obviously. It's it worked for certain cultures for hundreds of years, but it is a very more scholarly way of organizing something that's not as repeatable. It's not like the average idiot, even the dumbest guy in America knows, Fifth Amendment, I don't have to say anything to the cops. It's not, unfortunately, it's really not written in that sort of way to make it memorizable, which is maybe to its detriment. I don't know, but anyways, it's sort of a lot of feel-good concepts, some loosely worded, non-binding rules, and then some justifications as to where those rules came from. And we should also not forget that Russia exists in the paradigm of being a Western-style liberal democracy, which means it's bureaucratic. So basically, guys, as I've talked to a lot of people, and even dabbled my fingers there into the process of this whole lawmaking thing. If you're using terminology that doesn't exist in a legal framework in Russia, then you're just wasting your time. If there is no such term for in law, for example, there is no defining term for, again, traditional values or any of these pleasant sounding terms of ancestors or whatever. If we don't define those terms in a legal sense, then no laws or actions related to them can really happen. It's kind of like how there's been a lot of moves to help repatriate Russians, so we need to bring the repatriates back. But in a legal sense, there is no such entity as a repatriate Russian, right? And this causes a lot of problems. So, I don't know. Guys. I'm kind of sick. I don't like feel-good stuff. I don't like beating the drum, feel-good stuff. I like things that get stuff done, and, yeah. So anyways, about this whole concept of is there a hierarchy of values? I think in the West there is, and in this Russian document there really isn't. How do Europeans' values look like in the mirror of the Russian language? I wonder what they mean by that. Do the words used in the West to denote values, human rights, freedom, tolerance, diversity, just mean the same thing in Russian, or is there a difference in the meaning of these concepts? Yes. Well, in the first one, first off, diversity means nothing in Russia. Zero. There is no desire for it. It's not a political phenomenon. It just doesn't exist. No one cares. In fact, by default, people here are a lot more clannish when it comes to people of their own ethnicity. Maybe Russians less so because they're the overarching majority, but I think as time goes on, they'll become a bit more that way. If you want to talk about justice, that's a really long discussion. Russians, in the Russian language, justice and fairness are the same word. So thus, in a sort of Aristotelian logic sense, justice and fairness have to be the same thing. And so if something is just, it's fair. If it's fair, it's just. And that might sound like some kind of stupid, pedantic nuance, but you kind of see it in Russian society in the way that they view things, that, in all honesty, there is an overlay. So, essentially, fairness is a very important part of Russian society. However, fairness is a bit different. Like in America, we have this whole equality versus equity thing. So we have the super liberal wokey people who are saying equity, so we need to beat people into all being equal in some way, which is kind of what they tried to do in the Soviet Union. And then you have the equality people who are like, as long as everyone has the same rights in the Constitution, it doesn't matter if there's giant corporations that rule over us. We're all equal, yay. Both positions are kind of naive, and I think Russians are trying to kind of find a third position on that. My guess would be that it's something where every person sort of gets a somewhat respectful treatment as a human being, but ultimately life kind of remains unfair. I think that's what it's kind of boiled down to. But again, that's more my personal view of Russia, not so much Russians' view of Russia. Again, human rights. To be honest, people don't really care that much about that. Again, a lot of this stuff has to do with a more rulesy approach to things. And maybe one of the reasons why this Russian security document is more vague and full of nice-sounding words is because generally Russians don't really respond to rules and laws and this, that, and the other, and cold logic. Russia's not a creation of the Enlightenment. It's just stuck with having communism, which wouldn't have come to be if it weren't for the Enlightenment, and the Western liberal system that's stuck with today. So Russia's kind of stuck with all this stuff, even if it really isn't super native. So again, the Russian concept of freedom is very different because Russians are definitely on the side that freedom should have a purpose, that you should have have freedom to do something, and that freedom needs to be used responsibly. So, for example, a lot of times proof of freedom in the West is, okay, the old Soviet joke, in America, you guys are free. You can make fun of President Reagan. Well, guess what? In the Soviet Union, we're free because we can also make fun of President Reagan. That's kind of joke is very telling, and I think that definitely has a lot of there's a lot of truth to that, and the way that Russians actually view freedom, that freedom is something to be used responsibly, or like I was trying to mention that. In the West, you'll have someone, they feel that they're really free because they could make fun of Barack Obama on a TV show, or they could make horrible memes about the president. Whereas in Russia, it's more of a kind of the culture. You kind of want to respect the office and maybe some funny memes online, but you really wouldn't do that on TV. It's kind of a thing where ugly uses of freedom aren't proof that you're free. Like, the classic, in Sweden, you can masturbate on a park bench because it doesn't technically hurt anyone. Like, Russians don't want that. That's not for them freedom. That's disgusting. The freedom is something that has to be noble and to achieve something. And doing your private business on a park bench in front of everyone does not achieve that goal. So, yeah, I would say that Russians have a different set of interpretation of all these human rights, freedom, tolerance, diversity, justice. Like I said, diversity doesn't really exist here. And the whole idea of what human rights are is kind of not quite the same, because people would also include some sort of group rights into things. But again, no one has worked out the system. There are no official answers. There's no red book from Chairman Putin about how this is all supposed to work or whatever. So very vague, and when you're dealing with vagueness, it's really hard to say about this stuff. So anyways, next question. Are there values that could be called specific or particular to Russian? Maybe some of Russia's attitude towards war and self-sacrifice, the whole blending of justice and fairness into one is, I think, maybe a little bit more. This idea of land empire as being good, as in we're this giant land empire, but there are ethnicities within the empire that maintain their own sort of semi-autonomy, but have to speak Russian and pay taxes. And this also relates to the attitude towards war and how Russia expanded is kind of unique and different. And if the West would deal with its diversity the way Russians do, things probably would be better in the West. There's always something particular to any great civilization. All of them have their own unique specific features. But again, yeah, I think a lot of the whole self-sacrifice, or really that war, the whole war thing. Was it Peter the first who um, tried to force all of the nobility to make sure that all their sons had to go fight, and especially through military service, that's really how you maintained your noble status. And they put the 14 different echelons of nobility and how you got on the list depended on what you did for the state. So I think there's some sort of combination of service, especially military service, that is definitely part of the Russian sort of way of life. You can also see that Russia has had the unique opportunity that many of the larger regions of Russia, these huge swaths of land, had voluntarily decided to become part of Russia because they were scared of other greater powers exterminating them. So there's a certain level of having this, on the one hand, this extremely powerful, completely brutal military that can fight and will win, but at the same time, accepting defeated foes into the fold immediately and being willing to, save other people that border Russia from being exterminated from other greater civilizations. So something about that attitude towards the defeated, towards war, towards expansion, towards this land empire way of dealing with having a lot of diversity in your society. There's something that is really truly unique and different from I think the rest of the world. Yeah, I think that's all. That's kind of a big egg to crack into when you're just doing an interview. But I'll put my chips down on that one. But yeah, I think there probably could be something more that gives Russia a certain uniqueness. Well, obviously, we could get into Eastern Orthodoxy because Russia is the Eastern Orthodox civilization, ultimately. And so I don't know, I wanted to call them trends. They're not really trends. The psychological tendencies that we build in society associated with Eastern Orthodox Christianity can still be seen within Russia to this day, of attitudes that include your attitudes towards work and life and meaning, and how in some ways connected to self-sacrifice, that in Orthodoxy the meaning of your life is really created at the moment of your death. And there is sort of a cult for a glorious death that gives your life function and eternity, emulating Jesus Christ. So there's a lot to that, but you might have to talk to someone who's like an actual priest to really get into maybe some of the specifics of that. Next question. How does Russia evaluate what in Europe is labeled as European values? I think Russians just sort of see Europe as having gone insane, or they don't believe it's happening. For people who don't travel much, they don't see this, and they probably think that either this is some sort of like government propaganda against the West, or this is some sort of like weird isolated phenomenon that's been blown out of proportion. However, the madness of the West has exploded. When I was a teenager or a boy, these phenomenons were sort of boxed in and were left to like weird Californian intellectuals and tenured professors at liberal universities. But that has now changed, and the rabbit is out of the hat. The Pandora's box is opened, or whatever comparisons you want to make. So yeah, I think most Russians don't really understand this. However, they see it as being suicidal and destructive for the West, and they certainly don't want it to come here. So we're going from when I first came to Russia in the mid-2000s, we're going from the entire society here being convinced that the West was inherently superior. They were the living gods of this earth. They could do no wrong, and the only way to gain wealth or success or anything in this world was to worship and submit to the West. We have gone from that to the average person seeing the West as being either confused or corrupted in some way, or having to completely gone full satanic Sodom and Gomorrah, lost the plot, gone insane, committing cultural suicide, at the most, and at the minimum, committing cultural masochism, as I've heard, as that phrase was coined by the one article, I believe, from the Scotsman. So, yeah, that's how Russians see it, as being utterly disgusting. And I think for our more liberal Russian friends, they're more sad to see Europe committing suicide than anything perhaps happening in Russia. Because remember, for them, everything in Europe is vastly more important. Why is it so difficult to talk about values? Is it necessary to do it at all? I don't say it's difficult. I would say, well, the difficulty comes from our ineptitude in Russia to our ineptitude to logically and philosophically break down what the fuck we're talking about, and the necessity to understand that we have to think of things in a somewhat systemic way, that has to be an idea that can be spread to the masses, which is very ironic, because Christianity is really proof of how, if you have a good set of apologetics, and if you really believe in what you believe in, and you really work out what you believe in through a lot of councils, all those church councils, they worked it all out, and you really work out what you believe in, and you build a coherent idea, and you spread that coherent idea passionately and honestly, you can achieve a whole hell of a lot. Are we going to do that in Russia? No. We are stuck in vague platitudes. We are stuck in trying to find bureaucratic solutions to ideological questions, which doesn't work. Unfortunately, Russia is completely unaware or unwilling to take the steps necessary to make some sort of big ideological move forward, which is, of course, much to my chagrin as someone who lives here and agrees with this move towards traditional values. But let me just put this way. If you ask a person in Russia what are traditional values, it's going to be no LGBT stuff, none of that, and that you have parents, you have mom and you have dad, and you have kids and you get married. Okay, cool. Besides that, how does that work? What does that marriage look like? What are the sort of the rules? What are the gender norms? How many kids? What is the responsibility of the father? How does he interact with the kids? To what extent does religion have to be a part of the kids' lives if we're going to live in a traditional society? All these no answer, nothing, absolutely nothing. And I understand that sometimes you get into questions that are sort of unanswerable, right? You're always going to have some people who might say, we need a lot of religion, and some people might say, oh no, too much religion is bad for people. We should have it, but it should be in the background. You could get into that, but ultimately there's no discussion of that. We just have sort of accepted that we believe in traditional values. We don't know what the fuck we're talking about. And when you don't know what the fuck you're talking about, how can you do anything with it? It's completely amorphous. It's completely unknown. It's kind of like the hysterical position of a lot of like the wokeist, feminist sort of lefties, because they just know that they're consumed by hate for themselves, that they're generally people from the West, and they hate their own culture, they hate themselves, they hate humanity, and they just sort of make stuff up on the in the moment to justify this self-hatred and self-destruction on a scale we've never seen, or intellectual scale we've never seen, right? And they just sort of do stuff. And they believe in things that are directly contradictory, don't care, because it's all about the self-hate. And that's kind of the opposite. We're all about this like good feeling that we believe in the traditional values, and we're going to be narcissistic and say, yeah, we've moved away and we believe in traditional values. We're not going to really do anything about it. We're not going to determine what that is, or talk to historians about how traditional people lived, or create a more organized vision of how that's going to work given 21st century technology, considering traditional values arose way before 21st century technology and realities, especially media realities. No, we're not going to do that. We're just going to sit here basically in masturbatory glee, enjoying the fact that we think we're not doing the same self-destructive and mad things that they're doing in the West. Yeah, we're just going to be, it's intellectual laziness on a grand scale. So the West has self-destruction on a grand scale. Russia has intellectual sloth and flawed assertions towards how to get things done on a grand scale humanity may have never seen. So the actual result of this is a bit more mixed. That isn't to say that tomorrow we can't rise out of this. In fact, I even joined one organization that works on questions like this, and I'm going to do my best not to constantly swear, to deal with Russian intellectuals and get them to at least kind of, sort of, come up with something at least partially concrete. I am not a believer in this whole Russians are a mystery wrapped up in an enigma and all this other shit that essentially is just Churchill's vision of Russians that he didn't want to understand. But there is some vagueness in Russia and in Russian culture, and we got toned down the vagueness because it's hard to be productive when everything is extremely vague. That doesn't mean that we have to take a scientific, rational approach to anything, but too much vagueness is just an intellectual black hole that sucks in a lot of energy and yields nothing. So, final question. How do you assess the situation in Ukraine? Has the situation there been affected by the fact that under the influence of universal values, as a part of Ukrainian people, has lost its original traditional values? I don't know. I mean, there's not really much to say about this. Anyone who's followed this channel has been able to observe this descent into madness. Again, we have another descent into madness of what's happened in Ukraine, of this sort of like this process through propaganda of turning it into an anti-Russia, where we have we've had all these images from different restaurants where they put food on the menu that's named like meat of the Russians, bone of the Russian babies, and all this other stuff. This people being dragged down into the cycle of hate, and then the restoration of some of the most villainous, heinous Nazi criminals of World War II becoming glorified yet again, so on and so forth. I mean, there's not much really to say. If you've been following this war in Ukraine and you have at least reviewed some pro-Russian material, you're well aware of all this shit. Is this, because of universal values? Well, Stepan Bandera is not part of universal values, okay? And in fact, Russia was openly threw itself at universal Western values in the 90s. So did pretty much the entire world. So, the entire world didn't turn into Lvov, or Lviv, as many of you may know it because of the forced spelling changes. So, I don't know. I think that's a bizarre thing to say, that universal values, these quote universal values that are supposedly universal, but they really aren't, did this to Ukraine. No. This is a much more precise plan. So there you go, guys. This was kind of a weird interview that I just gave. I thought the questions were at least unusual. But unfortunately, guys, you're getting a lot of negativity out of me. Why? Because, again, Russia really has the ball in its hands. But unfortunately, it doesn't know the rules of the sport. What happens the first time Russians play American football? They commit a lot of penalties. First thing they do is commit false start because they don't know that you have to wait for the snap. And it's kind of like this, it's like we have the ball in our hands. We're on offense. We've got all these talented, great athletes, but we don't seem to know the rules of the ideological game. And it's really sad. It's really, really sad. Well, we'll see. I'll do my best to correct this, but what can you do?